questions first the ability of the European Union to continue to pursue its foreign and defense policy, but also it challenges the Global South in terms of coping with the consequences of this war, for which this Global South is absolutely not responsible. It also questioned the non-alignment of the non-aligned countries from the Global South. We all know that there was some kind of push in order for the countries of the Global South to take side in this war, and it was translated in the voting of the resolutions in the Security Council and in the General Assembly. So this morning, I would like to ask my colleague, the 6 panelists, to join me in order to share with us their take, their thoughts, their findings about some of the aspects that I outlined. I would like to call first Mr. Jorge Castañeda, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mexico and Professor of Political Science and Latin American Studies in New York University. My friend and colleague, Mr. Ian Lesser, who is the Vice President of the German Marshall Fund. Ambassador Alessandro Minuto Rizzo, President of NATO Defense College Foundation from Italy. Even if we don't have a presence of the Italian team in the World Cup, we have the presence of Ambassador Alessandro here. I will ask also Si Ahmed Rida Khattabi, and economist at the US Environment Protection Agency, and Fatim Zahramin Group, senior economist at the Policy Center of New South, to come forward and join us. And last but not least, Si Hamza Kha, whom we enjoyed, I think, during the last session, his intervention, very fact-based and very empirical findings on his studies. He is the co-founder of SOWIT. Si Hamza Kha, Shaham, thank you. So welcome to all of you, and I would like to express my appreciation for the staff of the Policy Center, who managed in really a very short time to put together all the logistics and be extremely helpful to all of us. So as I indicated earlier, NATO is occupying center stage. A lot of questions come to mind about the enlargement, about the extent of this war, about the extent of involvement, but also about the likelihood of the NATO continuing to reach out to the South in order to tackle the common challenges and the different crises. So I would like to begin by Mr. Minister Jorge Castañeda, who will share with us his thoughts. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, it's an honor to be back here in Marrakesh, and I would particularly like to thank the organizers for having convened this conference once again and for inviting me in particular once again. This is not a subject matter with which I am terribly familiar, but I think that this year that's coming to a close has shown that we have a lot of questions to ask about not only reaching out to the South or not on the part of NATO, but rather whether the South, or many countries in the South, have a great deal of sympathy or affinity for the type of stances that the NATO countries What do I do? Just shut up?
I think you fixed it.
I fixed it, all right. The type of stances that a great deal of affinity or sympathy for the type of stances that NATO and, of course, the United States and Western Europe have taken on the issue of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think what we found interesting over this past year, both at the UN and at bilateral meetings or regional meetings, is that there has been a tremendous amount, more than expected perhaps, of unity, of homogeneity among NATO countries and in general most of the global north countries in terms of condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine and supporting the Ukrainian resistance with money and with arms, undoubtedly with people, with human resources embedded in the Ukrainian resistance, the details of which we will probably become familiar with as time goes on. And at the same time, we have also witnessed a certain reluctance on the part of many countries of the global south to support this. I'll start with the region I know best, which is Latin America. Several countries have more or less openly supported President Putin in his ambitions. That's, of course, the case of the three dictatorships in Latin America, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. But it's also, to a certain extent, the case of other countries such as Bolivia and occasionally Argentina and Mexico. Brazil has been more ambiguous, but at the last Security Council vote, Mexico and Brazil are non-permanent Latin American members of the Security Council this year. Mexico's leaving, Brazil stays for another year. The last vote, which was on the annexations, if I'm not mistaken, Mexico voted in favor of the resolution condemning the annexations. Brazil abstained, which of course is typical for the Brazilians. It's a strange place because, you know, they've been ranting and raving and campaigning and making all sorts of fusses the past 50 years or more, wanting to become permanent members of the Security Council. And every time they're non-permanent members, basically they abstain. That's what they do in life, is abstain in the Security Council. So I never understood exactly why they want to become permanent members, maybe to become permanent abstentionists. Anyway, they abstained. And countries like Argentina, for understandable reasons, they have a real fertilizer issue. As one of the great grain producers in the world, and despite the extraordinary fertility of their soil, they still need fertilizers, as the Brazilians do. And Russia is one of the largest, if not the largest, producer of fertilizers in the world. So you have an issue there of the differences. In Africa, which all of you know far better than I do, there has also been a great reluctance to support NATO and the Americans on the Ukrainian question. By South Africa, most importantly perhaps, but by most of the countries. And this has been the case in the Security Council and at the Assembly. And if we go to Asia, well, obviously China is different, but India has been particularly reluctant, also for practical purposes, has not only maintained but flaunted its neutrality, sometimes supporting it with the idea of being able to play a role in mediation, which hasn't worked out so far. And so the question is, how long do you want to wait until you take sides, if that's the reason you want to not take sides? Partly because they've been able to buy cheap Russian oil, which has been a bargain for them and very useful, and partly because they have the long-standing relationship before with the Soviet Union and now with Russia, as the case of many other countries also in Asia. So NATO and the global south complicated. NATO and the southern Atlantic also complicated by Ukraine, by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, perhaps to be more specific, and perhaps by the idea that these are a little bit two different worlds, that the interests, the ambitions, the values are not the same. And I think there is, I can certainly tell in Latin America, there is certainly more sympathy for the Russians than I would have expected, less sympathy for the Ukrainians, less sympathy for NATO and the United States, And at the end of the day, for many of these countries, you know, it ends up being the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's a tough one to fight against, especially with countries in Latin America, as I tried to show in my chapter in the, in the book, the small book that we published that the Atlantic Dialogues has published, especially as more and more governments in Latin America tilt to the left. So I'll stop here, Ambassador, if it's all right.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for having me once again.
Well, I think that we have a glimpse of the perception by some Latin Americans about NATO and this war. Let's see what's, how about NATO from within? And I think that Ian Lesser and Ambassador Alessandro could share with us their views on these two aspects, to what extent it enhanced NATO and what are the prospects of the South keeping some interest within the NATO.
Well, thank you very much. Well, this is not very easy, in fact, as you said in your introduction. And this is not the first time that I contribute to this book. Happy to do so. NATO, of course, has become fashionable in different ways and from different points of view, but I don't want to speak about the war in Ukraine because I think this is something else. It's not the object of the discussion. I would like to explain a little bit to people who usually say the word NATO without knowing exactly what it is, and for good reasons, by the way, because it's a very bizarre organization in itself. And I will try to explain why. First of all, it's not really an international organization in the traditional sense. It is an alliance. And this is a difficult concept, if you like, but for all of us who have been to school, we have studied different alliances in histories. The different case of NATO is that this alliance was founded in 1949 and in 2022 is still there. Usually in history, normal alliances have a limited scope. They are done for a specific purpose, and then at the end, if you reach or not reach the purpose, they are dissolved. No, NATO is still there. So it says something about why it's there. And this is interesting. What I think you should keep in mind is very different, for instance, from the European Union, which is very often compared to NATO and somehow logically, but in a logical way you can compare, but in a practical way you cannot. Why? Because NATO, you should imagine perhaps a table with 30 people, the members, sitting around and deciding things together. So there is no commission, there is no external power. The 30 people have to decide together what to do. And interesting, nobody thinks about that, there is no vote. NATO has never voted, it doesn't exist. It is an alliance by consensus, which is a very soft, how can I say, not easy to define. Consensus means that if there is a proposal and nobody opposes that proposal, the proposal is accepted, which is a different way from making a vote. And I think it's very important to keep this in mind. Another thing which is not known, of course, by people who are external to this very specific affair, is that there is no real budget, in fact. The budget is what is paid for the headquarters, for the salary of a few persons at the top. But otherwise, being an alliance, the resources are provided by the Allied. So the Allied, they pay for themselves. If you take Afghanistan, for instance, again, every country participating into the operation in Afghanistan, but you can take another operation, Bosnia is exactly the same, they pay their own expenses. There is not a common budget like in the European Union where you draw resources. And of course, this gives a lot of responsibility to the different government. Another thing is that this alliance has proved, for reasons that is up to you to judge, very successful, in the sense that the original treaty in 1949, signed in Washington, you had only 12 members, 12 original members. Now you have 30, soon to be 32, probably, plus about 40 partners. It makes an immense and difficult, if you like, sort of arrangement to control and to put into measure. So it is easy, you know, to think that when you are 12, you have a clear objective, you know exactly more or less what you want to do, and the idea was to protect Europe from a possible Soviet invasion. That is why the famous Article 5 is well known. All this has changed completely. And so the alliance has to take these difficult decisions without really having a book in front of it somehow. You have the strategic concept, but the strategic concept is something different, you know. It's a sort of guide, but nothing more than that. It's not a legal obligation. And so after the various enlargements, there have been 8 enlargements, I've been surprised even by that, it was decided 3 or 4 years ago to reform the organization in the sense to give it more of a political specific direction. Because when you have 30 members, it's very difficult that those 30 members have the same priorities and the same political focus. They probably are in a different, not probably, they are certainly in different geographical areas, and they have different histories and different ideas about the future. And so to make a union out of that is extremely difficult. So there was a process underway, which was launched 3 years ago, called NATO 2030, and it was meant to address this political issue, the fact of political consultation and decision-making, and how to put NATO at the center of political conversation in the world about security issue. But of course, things, you know, are designed by humans in a way, and they happen in a different way, because the war exploded in Ukraine on 24th of February, and so the reform process, in a way, has been put aside because there is the war. And this is also something very important. So we had a summit in Madrid in June, a few months already after the beginning of the war, where you had a confirmation of this astonishing, in a way, unity of allied against Russia, which was not something which was written before the beginning of the war, and it took place. You have an enormous, how can I say, force now, allied force at the border with Russia, and a new strategic concept. I have to say briefly, because I think I don't have much time, perhaps can I say a few things about 1 minute? Okay. There are three core things in NATO. One is defense, common defense. If an ally is attacked, the others will help. The second one is crisis management, in the case of Afghanistan, in the case of Bosnia. And the third one, which is the one more interesting here in Morocco, is cooperative security. What does it mean, cooperative security? When I was in NATO, I was really the person in charge of that. So I'm very affectionate to this concept. I think it's very important because it means that you have different regions of the world with different priorities and different systems, then can put together something in order to project security around the world. And so the issue for NATO, and perhaps if I have to conclude, the issue for NATO is that we may win on the east and lose on the south. And that would be very bad, because I think that we have an enormous interest, both in the north and in the south, to have cooperation in the area of security and the area of energy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Well, I see that you insisted on this distinction between alliance and international organizations, and I read exactly the same advocacy in Iron Lesser Pepper. I think for those who taught international organizations, we have always indicated that NATO is an international organization of military character, because it has a charter, it has objectives, it has some principles, and it has a permanent structures. So it fits at least the basic element of an international organization. But let's hear from Ian his take on NATO being an alliance and an international organization.
Well, thank you very much. And it's let me just add my thanks, because it's a great pleasure to be here in person at this historic meeting. It's great. And, one of the things that I was trying to do in the piece that I wrote, and congratulations on the volume as well, was to think a little bit about what has changed since the beginning of this exercise, which was in fact always talking about things like the role of NATO in the South, but this notion of kind of wider Atlanticism, I come from an organization that's all about transatlantic cooperation, but why should that just be about what goes on between Washington and Brussels or Berlin or Paris or Rome? There's the rest. What happened to the rest of the Atlantic? And so there has always been this desire, I find very interesting, to sort of change our mental maps about what we mean by transatlantic relations, to think more in a north-south, south-south dimension as well. And there, I think, some of the points that have been made about NATO become very illuminating, because if you think about what has changed over the last decade in this, one of the very big changes is, 10 years ago, we didn't have an animating strategic conflict. There were a lot of security problems around the world, but you didn't have the kind of thing that we have today vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine and NATO. And so this is a big change. And I think when it's seen from the South, one can be sympathetic to the idea that if you're sitting in Brazil, or maybe it's true in Mexico and other places, you say, well, you had some decades of telling us that we were a source of instability affecting your security in the North and all the rest, crisis management. We need to have more cooperative security to manage these things, to build capacity. Now we have an example of a big animating conflict in the North making everybody else's life difficult. And so in that sense, it doesn't surprise me that there are major actors in the South who maybe share the view about the illegality, the immorality of Russian action, no question, but aren't necessarily buying, if I can say, the bigger sort of ideological confrontation as a model for what's going to go on and what will affect international institutions in the future. Who is like-minded about this? And we tend to talk about that in the North, but it's a very difficult question to answer. So it's a much more troubled scene, I think. Where does that leave us? I think you will find, yes, NATO is doing a great deal. NATO allies, above all the United States, 95% probably for Ukraine now. And maybe the other 5% wouldn't even make it there if it wasn't for the United States helping to do that. But there's also a piece that we don't see, as you alluded to, that's on the intelligence sharing side and many other things. And eventually we'll come to the reconstruction problem, which will be more global and will require international partners. So, it really has changed the scene entirely from a decade ago, when maybe we were sitting here and talking about what did it mean to talk about the wider Atlantic, even in security terms. I mean, I would just also end by saying that there is a kind of sense that somehow non-alignment is coming back. I'm not sure, we could debate that. I think there is a kind of functional non-alignment, that even within NATO, there are countries like Turkey, for example, that simply are not going to sign up to the sanctions regimes. And so there is a kind of functional non-alignment, in a way, that I think we're going to have to reckon with. But I know you want to get onto some other topics, and that was really how I was going to conclude, because I think even if it's a much more troubled scene now, that there are areas, whether you're talking about climate or environment or oceans policy or migration, where you have to have this kind of ability to think across latitudes and have partnerships that are not just in the North, but also in the South. And so it's great to be here for this conversation again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian. Well, I think that we've had a reasonable amount of time devoted to NATO and to the consequences of the war. Let's go back to something more empirical, more down to earth. Security, food security, droughts, water scarcity is something that the global South is experiencing, that this country is experiencing, especially this year, a very, very hard time that the Moroccan agriculture is going through. let's see from you what are the prospects, and if you have some recommendation or some perspective of possible solutions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. First of all, happy to be here with you and share our thoughts on our chapter. So, as you can see, I will take another route and talk about water insecurity. So, I believe that all of us know, we know that what it is, or we have an idea about what it is exactly, but I prefer to give you the UN definition so we are all on the same page. So I will quote the UN definition. Water security is defined as the capacity of a population to access to adequate quantities. So the first condition is adequate quantities of water of acceptable quality for sustaining livelihoods, human well-being, and socio-economic development. It's also protecting the population against waterborne pollution and water-related disaster. And finally, it's preserving aquatic ecosystems in a climate of peace and political stability. So from this definition, we can see clearly that water insecurity is not just about the physical absence of water, but the definition includes other dimensions such as the quality of water and even the way that we are adopting to manage it. So talking about numbers now, we can say that almost 3 billion people in the world are lacking access to water facilities, which is very huge because that means that approximately a quarter of the total population in the world lives in water-stressed countries, and many of these countries are located in the Atlantic Basin. We can, for example, cite the example of sub-Saharan Africa, of which the total about 40% of the total population in the sub-Saharan countries doesn't have access to primary water supply, and even in the Latin American and the Caribbean, where about 55% of the population doesn't have access to adequate sanitation. So certainly the situation is very different between countries, because countries in the region are contrasted in terms of water endowment and also in terms of demand, the quantity of water that is needed for either whether for the drinking water or also for the economic development and socio-economic development. So the situation is very different, but we can also talk about at the same time common challenges, because all of these countries are facing the same challenges. The first one to cite here is climate change. Climate change is affecting, as you said, Mr. the Ambassador, is affecting all the countries differently. Some countries are experiencing extreme droughts or rainfall irregularity in time and space. At the same time, some countries are experiencing floods and other extreme shocks, weather shocks that are not favorable for the development of the country. And here I will move to the other challenge, which is the increasing demand for water because of the population growth, obviously, and also because the need to develop and to increase economic wealth created by countries. And the last one, which is almost the most important one, I think, for me, is the quality, because sometimes we can have a lot of quantities of water that cannot be used for even for irrigation purposes. And this is even though we have a lot of quantities, this is a situation of water shortage. And here we have a lot of solutions that we can adopt to manage this issue. So finally, to conclude, I think we can all agree that we are living in a world with a lot of uncertainties. But now, for this example, the uncertainties is experienced in a vital resource that we should preserve for our well-being and also for the future generation. That's why urgent action should be taken. And I will let my co-author Ahmed talk about some appropriate solution that could be taken into consideration while developing or elaborating water policies in these countries that are suffering from these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, this works. Thank you, Fatima Zahra, for that wonderful introduction and wonderful setup. So I'm going to pick up where Fatima Zahra left off and just quickly summarize. So basically, there are two main problems. There's a water quantity problem, and there's a water quality problem that we're facing. With the water quantity problem, basically the problem is in many cases, we don't have enough water. The predominant solution has been to focus on augmenting water supply. So if we don't have enough water, let's get more water. Or let's assure that we have enough water to do what we want to do. And that typically involves the construction of dams and reservoirs, infrastructure to transfer water, attempts to stem leaks. We lose a lot of water to leaks. And then more recently, there's a turn towards infrastructure projects such as desalination and water reuse. All of these projects are extremely important to assure regional water security. But I have to point out that some of these projects have significant environmental consequences and costs that have implications for water quality, something that Fatima Zahra heavily emphasized. And I think I don't really have time to go into the details, so I want to let Hamza talk about food security, which is also related to water security. And that's, I guess, where I plug our chapter in the Atlantic currents. But I want to say that despite their environmental costs and consequences, each of these solutions have their place. It's just that we have to seriously think about each of these solutions holistically and consider their environmental costs in decision making. And think about alternatives that may be more cost effective. And that's where we consider other alternatives such as demand management. So demand management is the idea that we can modify behavior to curb unnecessary usage, to reduce water waste and promote water conservation. In doing so, we can save billions of liters and avoid costly infrastructure projects, and also avoid environmental costs. That being said, demand management strategies can be very tricky to implement, especially in developing countries and especially with respect to strategies that have to do with price. You increase price, you quickly run into social issues, such as affordability, the notion of human rights to water, and so that often ends up in widespread riots and protests. So very special care is needed to consider these interventions. Moving on to water quality, like Fatima Zahra said, there are many solutions, but it really depends on where the pollutants are coming from. If the pollutants are coming from identifiable sources, then we can easily implement some sort of permitting scheme that allows us to track and monitor pollution. But that also requires strong institutions for the monitoring and evaluation to make sure that we're enforcing a lot of the provisions in the permits. If we can't track where the pollutants are coming from, right? If they're coming from non-identifiable sources, then it gets a bit trickier. But we can certainly turn to things like best management practices, or there's a big turn towards green infrastructure for surface water protection. And that I can't emphasize the green infrastructure enough because it really brings up the importance of protecting key environmental ecosystems such as wetlands, such as forests, that can do a lot of the water quality filtration for us without the need for costly gray infrastructure. Everything I've talked about up until now, the both of us have talked about, really have to do with managing water within a nation's boundaries, and some things that are under our control, or from a nation's control. But it's very important to remember that water does not respect or does not know political boundaries. Both surface water and groundwater crosses political boundaries. And so, it's important for countries and for policies not only to consider or to think about how to manage its own water resources, but to think about its relationships with its neighbors with whom it shares water resources. to mitigate both potential conflicts around water and to increase potential for collaboration around water. And that's where I think there may be opportunities for a multinational approach. Not just between the neighbors, but a wider, maybe an Atlantic Basin, maybe an international approach. There's certainly plenty of opportunities around increasing systems or implementing systems for water accounting, to measure quantities of water. Actually, there was a satellite that was just launched yesterday to help with this effort. There are certainly efforts to, or this also will, there are also opportunities to protect key ecosystems that I mentioned. That was one of the results of COP15 in Montreal. And last but not least, it's also an opportunity for countries to lend their diplomatic services to countries that are really struggling with navigating some of the political tensions around sharing water resources with other countries. So that's where I'll leave it, and I'll turn it over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I hope that due attention will be paid during the African United States Summit to this extremely important issue of a paramount importance to southern countries. I think that whenever the developing countries are trying to manage environment, trying to manage the different challenges, there is always two stumbling blocks. First, funding. Secondly, technology. And in the view of the Hamza Khasham, we have to work towards convergence between agriculture and between technology. Can you elaborate on this plea for this convergence, please?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for the opportunity to present this chapter. I think we have here a great transition when we talk about technology in order to do desalination of water. Farmers used to pay 1 dirham per kilo water when pumping water. Now with desalination, every meter cube of water, this is 15 kilowatts, which means 15 dirhams. I know no farmers that will be able to pay this money to get water in a country where 87% of water is used by agriculture. The problem here, I will get a bit more philosophical before getting more practical, is that technology has been playing against nature in a certain way, in the way that it served human welfare and human purpose in domesticating nature in a way to achieve productivity goals. And the main consequence of technology being in a certain mean in order to make nature productive and in a reproducible way is a backlash in terms of environmental consequence, as we are witnessing today, for example, in Morocco, with water scarcity, but also problems around water quality, because water that is saline is not adequate in order to achieve irrigation, for example, for fruit trees from one hand. But the other backlash is that all the technology, the tech ecosystem, is not able to provide long-term solutions that are really serving the purpose of building a sustainable intensification in farming. In the sense that all the technology is, in a way, getting more from nature. And as you all probably know, with the principle of entropy, there is no way we could reverse this sense of building nature. And the more we consume it, the more we lack of it, and the more we are facing an equation that is more and more tricky to solve. In the chapter, I actually try to explore, as a practitioner working in technology and serving more than 40,000 farmers in the continent, Morocco, Ivory Coast, Rwanda, Ethiopia, we try to explore how technology could kind of emancipate from this paradox, which is human belonging to nature and in a certain way being trapped by his own behavior, which is domesticating it and creating scarcity that it will undergo more and more on the long run. And there are actually certain technology that emerged in the last 5 years and that show that there is a pathway, there are possibilities in order for technology not to play against nature, but to play with nature. And these pathways that we explored within the article are first ecological intensification. There are technology today that accelerate the natural mechanisms that are in the soil. For example, mineralization that creates the availability of nitrogen within the soil and reduce the use of fertilizer on the long run. These technologies rely on microorganisms that will play a certain role in the acceleration of natural process and not in using external factor that at the long run would simply ruin, limit the availability of nutrients within the soil. Same goes, for example, for satellite imagery. We had the opportunity in Morocco to launch a satellite that is very focused with multispectral imagery towards observing the water content in the vegetation. And actually, it showed that these technologies allow us to better understand, to better measure, and in a certain way to respect the way nature is going, the way it is evolving, and how we can intervene to limit water use. And in this way, it's very interesting to see that Morocco today, Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt serve as examples for countries such as Spain, Italy, or France, because we experienced much before the lack of water resources and the need to think irrigation with deficit irrigation in a way that I am not able to satisfy the crop needs in terms of water. I need to play as if I need to find a balance with limited water resources. And this opened a broad avenue for research in order to look for the right balance in terms of water need for a certain crop, in terms of what I can give on the long run, and in terms of what I can get as a farmer in order to survive and in order to provide food security for my environment. This being said, this ability for technology to accelerate the way of playing with nature and ensuring the food security is practical and real. There is one country, Rwanda, that already achieved its objectives following the Malabo panel agreements with ensuring food security in cultivating cereals in very tough conditions that were not appropriate and in delivering very high yield between 5 tons and 6 tons per hectare that are comparable to Chinese or Indian yields. It means that by leveraging technology in the right way, which is thinking long-term, playing on the acceleration of natural processes with agroecological acceleration and intensification, which is, by the way, delivering more yields than conventional farming when it's practiced way. And observing nature relying on technology that enable right measurements, all these technologies and solutions offer a possibility today to achieve food security on the short term and to play with nature on the long term. And the Indian Revolution, the Indian Green Revolution, was a very good example of the Indian Green Revolution 1.0 and the Indian Green Revolution 2.0, starting by prioritizing production goal, but creating a backlash in terms of environmental and nutritional issues, and now involving technologies in a way that nutritional and environmental priorities need to be part of the equation. How could we afford that now India is being trapped within a cereal dietary pattern that it couldn't afford on the long term, where it was relying on millet that was providing very high productivity under very tough conditions? This is what the chapter is about showing that technology is evolving in a critical and fundamental way today, as going from domestication of nature and playing for human welfare, sometimes against nature, to playing with nature based on a better observation on nature and on providing tools that would accelerate natural processes that are already good for human beings.
Thank you, sir. I do have an immediate reaction to what you had just said. I think you did say a lot of very positive things about the use of technology in our respective countries, but are these technologies accessible, affordable to the small farmers, or is it something that is the monopoly of those who can really afford this very costly technology?
So you touched upon the African Union also institutional effort. In 2018, the Executive Council of the African Union exhorted all member states in Addis Ababa to adopt drone for agriculture technology. Drones enable today in Morocco farmers to do crop spraying, to spray products on their farms. First, it's less expensive than a tractor because it has a throughput. It can work 50 hectares a day when a tractor can work 10 hectares a day. So you can amortize the investment much faster. Secondly, it spray product in very specific area. So you save on phytosanitary product, which make you earn a lot of money given their current price especially. And third, with regulation evolving in a favorable way, even in Morocco, where actually they are being used, even if, I mean, common opinion thinks it's not being used, it is being used over thousands of hectares. It creates also for farmers an opportunity to adopt technology and for youth to see agriculture as an activity in which they can involve positively. So I do believe these technologies are more and more mainstream. 5 years ago, 1 hectare of satellite imagery data costed $80. Today, with, for example, Airbus Neo Pléiade program, the satellite constellation of Airbus, 1 hectare is less than 15 cents for the imagery. So the availability of the technology, the cost, regulation getting more and more soft because they see the potential of it, creates a momentum. But I would agree with you that the very small holder, if not aggregated, still find it very hard to adopt.
Thank you. Well, I'm the first to acknowledge that I didn't do justice to all the articles that have been written by my colleagues in this 9th edition of Atlantic Current. But I'm sure that if I turn to the audience, we will have comments and we will have questions that will complement what have been said so far. Please, go ahead. Can we have a microphone, please? Two microphones might be much better, so that we can.
Marcos Freitas from Brazil, Senior Fellow at the Policy Center. My question is to Ian. Earlier this year when we met in Brussels, you said that the world wasn't preparing to dealing with a ruthless leader, right? And there was, what was happening in Russia and all that. So as you are doing the chapter and thinking about the future, what is the perspective that we can envision for Russia in the coming years? What would be like for the West, what would be the ideal outcome for the whole situation? And how do we guarantee that the day after we do not end up with a situation that is worse than we currently have?
Yeah. I mean, Marcus, thank you very much. It's good to see you and good to have your easy question. Look, I mean, I think, especially for the United States at the moment, but I think it's true across NATO, there is a kind of embedded thought, and it's probably correct to an extent, that without a change of leadership, let's say regime, but leadership in Russia, it would be very difficult to get out of this. I mean, my own view would be that however the conflict in Ukraine, I won't say ends, but stops, there is going to be a very tense relationship with Russia for a very long time to come without something fundamentally changing. Now, I don't know whether Emmanuel Macron is right about saying that you have to, start now to talk about a security architecture to integrate Russia. This is not so easy to do, and part of it goes to I think your starting point, which was, or maybe it was mine, but anyway, this question of what we're dealing with, because I think part of the shock of this crisis has been the sheer ruthlessness of the regime. That we had thought about deterrence and defense with rational actors, with irrational actors. We hadn't thought too much about sheer ruthlessness. Rational, but ruthless. And it personalizes this situation in a way that I think is very difficult to escape from. So I think, I'm not going to predict where the Russian system goes. It's a big place with there's a lot of history there and a lot of embedded geopolitics. Some of it is presumably structural, but it doesn't have to be the way it is. And I have to think that a lot of this has to do with the sheer ruthlessness and ambition of an individual, who is thinking as much about, about his regime security as he is about, the role of Russia in the world. We could have a huge, long conversation about this, but it's some thoughts. It's not an answer, it's a response.
Please.
Rabia Muhtar, Texas A&M University. The role of water reuse and non-traditional water for agriculture and food security has not been mentioned. What's the role you think in Morocco and in the region for that? Anyone?
Wouldn't be me. although I'm interested.
Okay.
So,
I
so
can
just to from the Moroccan side, we're still very far from experiences such as what's happening in Spain or in Israel, where water reuse serves agriculture in the way that we still rely for the irrigated perimeters on dams that over the 30 last years were enabling Morocco to irrigate 1.2 million hectares out of 8 million. It means that relying on the water availability following a very proactive and ambitious dam strategy enabled us to get comfort over the last 3 decades, not seeing that water reuse could be the possibility before going to technology that are highly energy intensive. The situation is similar in North Africa, whether we are in Tunisia or whether we are in Algeria, over which we relied from one hand on rainfall for regions that receive more than 500 millimeters a year, and on dams for regions that do not. Today, there are projects, but they are still very minimal in comparison with desalination projects that seems to be, I wouldn't say trendy, but more, I will let you maybe,
if you allow me
explain on
just,
this, yeah.
If you allow me just to explain the water policy in Morocco, because we have a great, a historical policy that is really great. Knowing that Morocco is located in a region with characterized with water scarcity, we tried at first to mobilize the maximum of water, quantities of water that is possible. That's why we tried to implement the dams policy to mobilize the quantity of water needed for whether for drinking water or for agriculture. And then we tried to since the quantity of water was mobilized, we tried to manage the demand side. So we tried to introduce new technologies that tries to improve water productivity, exactly in the agricultural sector, mostly in the agricultural sector, which because it consumes large parts of the water. So we are trying now to see to improve the productivity of water by using new technologies and looking for other sources of water such as desalination or water use. But if we look at the quantities that we can be mobilized from these other sources. And compared to the quantities that are mobilized from dams, it will be marginal because we have a lot of dams that could be filled by rainfall, which is, I think, which saved us many times during droughts and during extreme weathers.
I would also add that most of the water for agriculture comes from groundwater. And so, you know, the opportunities for water reuse, though, are there. I think there's higher opportunity for water reuse in urban environments where, you know, water treatment plants need to be upgraded. And we can use water reuse for other purposes that maybe not are potable. Even though we could very well treat reuse or wastewater to potable standards, there's still this reluctance on the part of people to consider that possibility. But there's certainly opportunities for water reuse to be used, or wastewater to be treated for industrial purposes, for landscaping purposes. And those will be, I think, low-hanging fruit that I think we should turn to first. With agriculture, it's a bit difficult because it sources most of its water from groundwater. In other words, you need a lot more infrastructure to be put in order to start taking advantage of water reuse. And so that's, I would start with water reuse within the urban environment rather than the agriculture environment. With the agriculture environment, it's probably low-hanging fruit, you know, just turning towards strategies that minimize water use to begin with, so things like drip irrigation. I mean, the other thing with groundwater is that we pump out so much groundwater that we end up depleting the aquifers, and then with something like drip irrigation, we return very little to the aquifer itself, and so that's a whole other problem. But with water reuse, I think it's, the opportunities are a lot more salient in urban environments.
Thank you.
J'ai déjà le micro. I already have the mic. Je vais intervenir en français. Moi, je suis membre du...
I'm a member of the Policy Center as a fellow member. I am from Senegal. I have really liked what Fatem Zahra said earlier on the water quality.
Universel.
Talk about universal statistics.
L'eau, mais quelle eau?
What water in our community?
Qui a accès à une eau salée.
You have half of the population that has access to water.
De trouver des solutions pour désaliniser.
We have to find new solutions to desalinate and to do water transfer.
National avec les Nations Unies.
UN International Conference, it was suggested that in the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, that we apply an indicator on the water quality. Because today we keep talking about water access. It is something very important indeed, extremely important. Earlier on you spoke about desalination. It is very expensive in energy.
L'eau. Et donc je pense que il faudrait avoir technologie.
Of course, the farmers could have this technology available. We could have a mini drilling with the solar energy, and it works pretty well.
Thank you. I have a simple question about definition of wider Atlantic.
About?
What do you mean geographically by wider Atlantic, especially that we in the Middle East started to read and hear about a NATO in the Middle East. So, and you have mentioned in your excellent intervention, sir, that the number of countries joining NATO would exceed 40, which means 1/5 of the number of all countries in the world. So this raises a lot of questions that need to be explained. What you really mean by wider Atlantic? Is it only South Atlantic, or it goes further and further to the east?
I understand it is for me. well, you know, of course, it's a good question. I think you have to take a general view. And in the last, I don't know, sort of 20 years, 15 years, in all the summits of the alliance, as I explained before, it's an alliance, the general concept, you know, was that to try to provide security 360 degrees, which of course is a vague concept, of course, it's clearly, you know. And for instance, in the last summit in Madrid, the idea of including Indo-Pacific into the objective of future NATO cooperation has been written. It is very vague, of course, because it's also written how you do that and why exactly you do it, you know. But the idea is that you can certainly, because many people think of NATO, perhaps it's what is in your mind also, as a purely military organization, a sort of organization goes somewhere to bomb somebody, not somebody else. I think, you know, this is a little bit of a stereotype, because being a security organization, it means that it tries to help others to improve their own security. And the entire idea, for instance, that started in the beginning of this century, especially the summit of Istanbul in 2004, was for NATO to help the Arab countries to be stronger in their own capabilities, in their own way of facing threats like international terrorism and other things, having a healthy military system, for instance, with a good relation with the public, a transparent budget, all these things. So I think it is I understand the reasons, of course, but very wrong to think that NATO is an organization which is only able to bomb somebody. This is not really the purpose of that. There have been examples, of course, Bosnia, etc. But on the other hand, as I said before in my brief introduction, NATO today has about 40 partners, Morocco being one of them, and I don't think that Morocco is resenting any kind of pressure by NATO at all. What it has done is that there are contacts among diplomats and among military, and the program of work is established every year. It is consensual, and there is no treaty and no threat to anybody. It's just to enlarge the area of security in the world. It's ambitious, but you know, it's the right direction for me.
Thank you so very much. It's wonderful to be back here again in person. I have a question perhaps for our very good friend Ian. Ian, I'm sorry, both Marcus and I are asking you. But my questions are as follows. I was rather intrigued by your sense that it's a functional non-alignment, but not an alignment in the classic sense. And I agree with you, and yet I disagree a little bit. And I'd like more of your view on why you think the way you think. Because when we take a look at what's happening with the BRICS that have now gone to a plus format, when we take a look at what's happening with SCO, every country in the global south is on the waiting list for membership of both of those organizations. They're distinctly non-Western. And those alliances are deepening and widening as we speak. So that's the first question I have. And the second is also a remark that you made. You said, well, the sort of future we're thinking about, perhaps we can't secure with Putin still there. And the question simply is this. I'm reflecting a little bit on a statement made by President Biden earlier this year on the border of Ukraine. And he made, off-the-cuff remark, and he said, for Christ's sake, why is this man still there? It raised all sorts of questions you will remember. But if we think of what happened in Iraq when the leader was taken out, what has happened with Libya after Gaddafi, I mean, what sort of future are we talking about? Is anyone even thinking about tomorrow?
Len, thank you very, very much. And I hesitate even to answer, especially your first question, because you've just written a book on it. And so, just to say, I think, look, we're in a very different world now, and will it resemble the kind of alignment, non-alignment, and the measures of that we had for decades during the Cold War? I'm not sure. I think, it's likely to be different in a lot of different ways. We'll have to see. But what is very clear is that that there has to be a degree, I would say, of flexibility. And I think you see this actually from the Biden administration when they talk about relations with India or with Brazil or South Africa and others, that there's an understanding that complete alignment on this question of how to deal with Russia is impossible. The same thing, by the way, true for China, maybe even to a greater extent in some ways. And so I think, we are moving into, a world with much less rigidity, in a sense, about this, but with much more risk because, even for the United States during the Cold War, the irony is we have less understanding about each other today and less risk management today than we had at the height of the Cold War. And that's a rather disturbing prospect. And everybody is exposed to the consequences of that. It's not just a thing in the North. Where that leaves us, I'm not entirely sure, but when you look at some of the key vehicles that have been used to kind of build this sort of international policy in response, sanctions, for example, it's very clear this is going to be applied in very different ways or not applied in different places. We could be in for something quite structural there. The personality, this does remind us in a way that personalities matter in politics and strategy, people matter. You don't have to personalize these things, I would say, in a way that perhaps, say, the Trump administration did. Saw it all through that lens. That the institutions didn't matter hardly at all. That's not the case in Washington today, looking from that perspective. Would it matter if Putin was not the decision maker in this case? Probably it would, I would guess. But you're absolutely right to point to some of the recent history, admittedly on different scales, but anyway, some of the recent history with Iraq, with Libya, and elsewhere, where, you know, getting rid of the so-called troublemaker that's the start of the problem. That's not the end of the strategy. And we've been very bad historically, we, the West, international community, at managing that continuum after you actually bring some change. That's not easy. Afghanistan is it's not personalized, but it's a different case. So, I mean, it's a world of very, very complex thing in which, you know, these sort of black and white alignments are, I think, not going to be possible, and we're going to have strategies that accept that.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. I tend to agree with the reluctance that was expressed by the distinguished former Foreign Minister of Mexico about the role, about the vision of the member states in the United Nations. If you look at the 5 resolutions that were adopted by the General Assembly, you find that 3 of them have sustained 143, 145 votes, and then all of a sudden it dropped to 94. Why? Because it came to the issue of calculating the damages and attempts to confiscate the $300 billion by Russians in European and the United States countries. So member states got puzzled. So should we vote in favor of this or not? Should we start really a process that should be started by the Security Council or not? And that is what created this kind, and this is going to lead to further decline in the lack of support. Nobody is letting go of the main principles of the United Nations. When you speak about the main principles, everybody is going to vote for it. Non-aligned, non-aligned, everybody, Europeans, Americans, others. But the feeling in the UN is that this is a war that has turned to be a war between the United States and the Europeans in Ukraine. And that is creating the same feeling that happened before, what happened with the last speaker, in Iraq, in Libya, in other places that in the Arab world, and also the double standard related to dealing with the Palestinian question. Look how many years Palestine has been occupied, and nobody is moving a finger to move the occupation. At the time that Ukraine is occupied only for 1 year, and Europe has already geared up half military capacity to go through, and the US has spent $65 billion to send armaments and experts. And if you're going to talk about compensations and you're going to talk about damages, there is the separating wall. There is the ICJ advisory opinion of 2004 that had already established as a compensation fund and has already done this through a resolution of the Security Council. It finished its work. Nobody is moving a single finger to implement it. So the double standard also is creating a lot of confusion in the minds of member states. So how does Europeans and Americans intend to deal with this? I see what they are doing now. America is calling for a summit with Africa. Russians went to the African Union in Addis Ababa. Russians went to the Arab League in Cairo. So everybody is trying to make new alliances in order to be sounding and to try to attract as many votes as possible when it comes to the voting in the United Nations. So it is a very complicated scene that requires a lot of calculation, particularly from NATO and from the European Union. United States is benefiting 100%. NATO and European Union are losing, I would say, personally, 50%. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been asked to end this session in 5 minutes, otherwise I may run into sanctions So I will ask our colleague to ask his questions, and then we will have maybe some additional comments. And,
yes, I will speak in French because my English is not better.
L'anglais n'est pas meilleur que mon français. I wanted to, rightly so, I wanted to ask the following question in the aftermath of my colleagues' presentations and words earlier on. My question pertains to the efficiency of the world economic order, current world economic order, because in the aftermath of the Second World War, there has been the structure of the United Nations that have been created, including to create a certain balance between the bloc, the East Bloc and the West Bloc. The Eastern Bloc that was run, if I might say, by the USSR back then, and the Western Bloc, which is, of course, the Western Bloc. And at the end of the war, 5 countries that have been the measures of the war, i.e. the United States, Great Britain, China, the USSR, and as well as France, yes, France, well, do constitute, of course, the P5. So, of course, they were the winners of the war. And we have been given the possibility to see that this mechanism of world economic balance has really worked miracles up until 1993, where Gorbachev, has, with the perestroika, had caused the Western Bloc to burst, and the bubble was therefore burst. So what happened now with the dismantling of the USSR bloc? No, what happened is that we fell in what we consider today, what the world today perceived as the Western unilateralism. It is the Westerners who call the shots. If you are with them, you are being treated as an angel. If you're not, of course, you are a devil. And I think examples here have been given. For example, the war in Iraq. It's been said, Iraq freedom, we're going to bring peace and enshrine peace in Iraq. I don't know with hindsight today whether we've done that or not. We've also said that we're going to democratize Libya. Chances are legitimate to be asked as to whether we have or not democratized Libya. I think today there is a substantive question that we have to raise and ask ourselves, i.e. whether the United Nations systems that have been launched, initiator, post-war, if this balance system still exists, we shouldn't lose sight of the very fact that the war between the Americans, the United States in general, and the Russians is also a war of ideology. For the Americans, the Russians are the devils, and for the Russians, the Americans are the devils, you see. Any which way you want. Now, can this ideology question be settled with the world economic order, which has been set up in the aftermath of the war, and which today seems to be a little too old, too aged? Well, look now, the increase of some military forces. China is today the second world military power. India is the third world military power. Of course, there are the United States, Russia, China, India, in this order. Now, today, as things stand, the Americans have been able to ask China to abstain from warring or from entering into a war. If tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, Russia can put back or lead China and India in the war, what therefore would be the reaction of the world around us in this kind of unilateralism, Western flavored unilateralism? This is the question that I wanted to raise in order to know whether, and ask you whether the world economic order today is as is. Because this question of unilateralism does run the risk of leading us to one day, God forbid, to a third world war. Syria, we've seen that with Syria. If today Syria hasn't been really impacted adversely in the sempiternal causes and troubles, just like Libya and Iraq, it's because Russia has decided to act to put back a balance. But now, in the meantime, everyone does know that the Western world, and that the Bashar al-Assad leaves presidency before we even start talking about peace in Syria. Thank you. Thank you. Let me now to our Mr. Castelleda. I think he can provide some reactions and answers. I think this is a question, of course, that could lead to many, many books, not only one, because it's multilateralism, because it's a new world order, and what have you. But and it is the very first time since the Charter of the United Nations, first time ever, that a member of the P5 members is challenging the whole system of the United Nations. Say that
the whole charter, the veto power was built on the assumption that the five will have some kind of understanding or consensus in order to curtail any possibility of any country to do something harmful to the international community. But this is where you have the system now upside down. Qui va garder les gardiens?
Who is going to be the warden of the wardens? Who is going to be the one who is in charge of keeping up the place? This being said, I wish us a good appetite for lunch. And sorry, two microphones are open. I can't hear you. Please vote for Morocco team, please.
We're lucky not to answer the last two questions.
It was a good thing we didn't have to answer.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation this first morning. We will now break for networking lunches and reconvene at 2:15 p.m. Please enjoy your meal.
Je suis d'accord.